Hey girl gang, hey super mamas. I'm so glad to have both of you together for this combined series. We're talking about the rebirth of joy, reclaiming Black women's reproductive health and rights. So on this 7-part series, we're going to be talking to a variety of speakers about what has happened in the past, what's happening now, and what's happening in the future with regards to Black women's bodies and Black birthing people's rights. I can't wait to introduce you to my special guest today, Miss Liz Leiba, who is a true expert in her field, and we're going to be talking about historical context. So make sure you keep watching. All right, y'all. So today we have a very special guest. I am absolutely delighted to have Miss Liz Leiba, who is a historian, a true powerhouse in the media world. She is a top voice on LinkedIn, and that's actually how I met her. She has developed a curriculum that is just absolutely amazing that I've been following. She has the Black History Culture Academy. And I have been a part of that now for, I guess, about 6 to 8 months. And there are all kinds of modules that you can do online to learn more about Black history and culture. She has a podcast with the Ebony Media Group that's called Power Moves, Black Power Moves. And then a new website that she's launched called Black Women Handle Business, which I absolutely love the sound of that. So I want you guys to welcome Liz to the show today. Welcome, Liz.
So much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So one of the things that really drew me to your content on social media is that you were posting some just really amazing content about Black history and culture. And, you know, not only was it engaging and fun, but it was just so historically accurate. I'm like a type of person who likes a lot of receipts. And I was actually, able to find the receipts of the information that you were posting. And that kind of encouraged me to become a member of your Black History and Culture Academy. So tell me a little bit about how you got started with this research.
It's a really good question. I became pretty prolific posting on LinkedIn in 2020, right after George Floyd was murdered. And it really was almost more like as an educator. I started to just see that people were posting and saying, wow, a Black man was murdered. Wow, police are profiling people. Wow, someone could go to jail and be suspected of doing something and be killed in the street. And a lot of people were really, especially those in the majority culture, were really surprised by that. And I think that me as someone that I've been a college professor since about 2008, and I've always been someone that is very fascinated by Black history and culture, African American history and culture, African history and culture. So with me teaching American literature, I've always looked at history through the lens of storytelling and what the real story of the Black experience in America has been. And I found a lot of people just really weren't aware. When I started posting during Black history, I think was right before George Floyd was murdered in May. So I had been posting some little facts and tidbits about Black history, and I found a lot of people were not aware of some of the just basics of Black history. And then when he was murdered, I just became a lot more intentional, just aware of some of the real facts of what this country has been and what the Black experience has been and what slavery has done and Jim Crow era has done and what today means, and in more of a historical context, not just George Floyd was murdered, how could this happen? This is not America. And I kept hearing this is not America. And it's like, well, 4,000 people, men and women, were lynched between 1865, which was the end of which was the beginning of Reconstruction. So if 4,000 plus people could be lynched in that time, George Floyd's murder by the police was unfortunate. It was really sad and devastating, traumatic for us to witness that, but it wasn't unusual. So that's really where I got the idea for Black History Culture Academy. It was like, okay, if I can create a resource where people can go get, just an unlimited amount for just more of a subscription style, not like what I would do in college, but for a college course for 16 weeks, you might have to pay a couple $1,000, $3,000, sit down, go to class every week, or, log on, do assignments. No, most people don't have time to do that. They don't want to take an undergraduate course in American history or African American history, but a lot of people I found when I was doing surveys on LinkedIn, have you taken a class of African American history? Majority of people said they had not. And that I think was troubling for me because a lot of people, Black and white, had never really been exposed to African American history. And I think that was problematic because it means that you really have a whole sector of the country that you have no idea about.
Right. And I think that since we don't really teach critical race theory in most places in the United States, people kind of have this the history that they may have been taught in schools is missing half of half of the actual historical content that it needs to be complete. So, with regards to the rebirth of joy, when we're talking about the historical context for Black women and about enslavement and what actually was happening during in this country during enslavement, tell us a little bit about that from a historical context. What was that like?
Yeah, through a historical lens, I think there's also almost like a romanticizing of the historical aspect of Black women's place in American history since the beginning of time. 1600s literally is when Black folk first, or even previous to that, but we say 1619 is around the time that Black folk first set foot on this land. And Black women have been almost romanticized as, you hear the Sally Hemings and, Thomas Jefferson, you hear these stories of Black women and it's almost as though they were treated fairly or they were in the house or, they didn't have it that hard. And I think that is historically is totally inaccurate. Black women had, from the beginning of slavery, had no autonomy over their own bodies. They really were not given any kind of freedom to pick and choose. And I think sometimes there's a sense of, people don't want to talk about that because it's a little bit, it feels uncomfortable to think about the idea that someone literally could be married in the sense of what an enslaved person could be, which is a commitment to someone. They really couldn't be married in the sense of a church and a legal sense of marriage. But if someone had a commitment to someone else in the context of they were both enslaved, or create with this individual, because both of you guys, from a genealogical standpoint, if you're tall, he's tall, your husband is short, your quote unquote husband, because it wasn't a legal marriage, it was to enslaved folk, you need to go make X number of children with this person. And that marriage at this point is null and void. Your husband has no say so because I own you and I need X number of children from you. Black women often, and this is all historically documented, were told they had to have at least 10 children. So you would have women that had 10 children, had born 10 children by the age of, in their early 20s, started having children maybe at the age, as soon as they hit puberty, 13, 14. They were having children by that time. You had women that were promised their freedom if they had at least 15 children. And we all know, those of us that are mothers, the amount of intense, what it puts on your body when you have a child. And to think that women up until the age of their mid-20s would have probably a child a year till they could satisfy having that 10 or 15 children. The idea that you had no autonomy over when or where your owner, the plantation owner, at any time could, and his wife would turn a blind eye, say, well, you come with me for tonight, you leave your husband, or I'm going to observe you while you go with this other man to make sure that you're doing what you need to do. And imagine how degrading that would be to know that you have a husband who's in the next shack, house, whatever, living accommodations, but you have to go with another man, or you have to go with the person that says that they own you. So a woman literally had no autonomy over her own body. Imagine that you have a child and now that child is ripped away from you and sold, but you have to go into the plantation owner's house and breastfeed his child because the woman that owns the plantation, it's degrading for her to take her breast out and feed a child because her body is too pure for that. Now you have to give the milk that was for your child. I'm getting goosebumps even thinking about it. No. The milk that was for your child, you have to give it to her baby because you're a wet nurse. Your job is to give the nourishment from your breast to her children because that's beneath her to do that. But yet your own child is gone, ripped away from you and sold. So all this degradation, all this ability to just basically just not have the ability to pick and choose, all this historically, you don't get to say where, who, when. You're literally almost like a toy. You're something that is owned by someone else and you're not able to. It would almost kind of like you would be almost like a machine. You wouldn't be able to feel for your own children. There was even Frederick Douglass. We recently celebrated his birthday. He was born in February. He picked February 14th for his birthday because he said his mom, what he could remember of his mom, she called him her little Valentine. But he didn't know who his mother was. He didn't know who his father was. He was light skinned. So he thought that his father was the owner of the plantation, but he didn't know. And his mother was so imagine if we think about children and how we say they should stay with their mom, they have to bond. That bonding period was not allowed because your child literally was not your own. Your child was a piece of property to be bought and sold at will. I remember when I breastfed my son, I breastfed him up to the age of 4. And I didn't intend to do that. He was so obsessed with breast milk. Right? He would be like, I need my milk. And I remember my mom being like, I breastfed my older daughter until she was 6 months old. And I was like, okay, 6 months is good enough. Let's get her a bottle now. And she really didn't want the bottle, but I was like, recommended amount of time was 6 months. Now it's time for her to get a bottle. I remember my mom being really critical of me. I've never seen anything like that. That's like Africa, like that seems very like backwards that you're doing that. And I think a lot of us, in the historical context, we've been taught that a lot of the maternal instinct, the norms and things that we should be doing, breastfeeding our children, nurturing our children, being close with our children, having that bonding time with our children. A lot of that is because of some of the historical, when we think about that post-traumatic slave syndrome, we've been taught that certain things are like, if a child is crying, don't rush and pick them up, let them, because we have been taught to a certain extent. And that is historical. A lot of this is coming from the fact that this has been the Black way of having children, the idea that we are supposed to just have them and then literally that is just a moment in time. And that's all coming from, the idea that was basically established during slavery.
Right. And maybe a coping mechanism, like,
Absolutely.
because there is no other way you can survive that level of trauma unless you detach yourself from that situation, from that child, from that husband, from that, so there's only one way to survive that, and that is to emotionally and mentally detach yourself. So that is just, oh my gosh. I mean, I guess at some level we know these things, we've heard them and we're kind of aware, but to actually hear it described in detail is, I don't even know that I have words for it, and as a gynecologist, I hear a lot about how modern gynecology developed, and about Dr. J. Marion Sims, who many talk about as maybe we don't even need to refer to him as a doctor.
A lot of people don't.
Been a quack, and that he was just given the opportunity to butcher women without anesthesia. Many women, but the women that we hear of most often, that we know of most often, are Betsy, Lucy, and Anarcha. And developing this procedure where he was trying to perfect the repair of fistulas, and that can happen when women are having babies, especially if they're having babies like you described, like year after year after year, thinking that if I can just get to 15, I can maybe be free. That is just.
And a lot of times they would say that and then they still wouldn't do it,
Right.
I mean, you think about that. I mean, Sally Hemings is an example of when Thomas Jefferson promised her, like, if you blah, 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 I will free your children, or I will free you. And we all know that she was never freed. So yeah, they would promise that, but that would almost be like dangling a carrot, like, keep doing this and then you'll get what you want. And oftentimes that was reneged on as well.
Right. And that's just such a horrible thing. And I just feel like, those fistulas and just the physical repercussions of what happened to these women, it's so horrendous just to even consider as a gynecologist. And then as a gynecologist, to consider the fact that these surgeries were carried out in the conditions in which they were carried out, with no anesthesia. And at that time, there was anesthesia available. We had developed using ether for anesthetizing people so that they're kind of put to sleep, and you're able to do surgery on them, where they're more comfortable. and you can take your time and actually do a procedure well. First of all, let's just be real graphic about this. That is one of the most sensitive areas in the body. That's the area called the perineum. It's the area between your vagina and your anus. What has some of the most intense nerve endings in your body. So if you've ever had a baby and you've had a hemorrhoid, or you tore and you had stitches or something like that, you know what I'm talking about.
It's unbearable, almost. It's like, yeah.
To take a knife and cut you there and put instruments and all this with no anesthesia whatsoever, it is inhumane. Absolutely inhumane. And I don't know how someone could call themselves a physician or a healer and do that to a body. It's just unimaginable. And when you read about J. Marion Sims and the number of people that he actually did this to, you know that he's sick, a very sick individual. What kind of stories did you come across when you were researching him for the Academy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like most of us, and like you said, it's horrific when you think about the idea that someone could, we know those 3 women, and particularly we hear about Anarcha because of the situation with the urine, and how trying to fix that and the bladder, it's almost paralyzing, because you need this part of your body so that you can be functional, and you can't hardly walk or whatever the case may be, using the bathroom properly. And yet, when I was looking at some of those stories of the things that he did, I think what stood out to me was pretty much what you said, this idea of the inhumanity, the lack of any kind of care or any kind of sensitivity or any kind of empathy. The idea that once he had perfected this procedure, he did go on to use it on white women, and he did use anesthesia. But the idea was almost as though Black women were more looked at as a guinea pig. You weren't it's almost like if you would think of when, if you take anatomy and physiology, like in high school or something, or in college, and you're dissecting, a frog or something like that. No one says, oh, this poor frog had to die so that we could dissect and learn about the anatomy. It's kind of like, this is just a frog. I don't really care about this. And I think that's literally what Black women were perceived as. Black women weren't perceived as people. There wasn't a sense that person has autonomy, or that person is that individual. When you think about the ability for someone to enslave someone, to own someone, I always say it's not like I own a laptop. I own, you might have an iPhone, you have, your books in your house, whatever, your flat screen TV. A flat screen TV doesn't have feelings. It's just what I need in order for me to watch my shows. So Black women and Black men and children were looked at in that sense. There was a sense of, this is not a person that I'm operating on. This is something that I need in order for me to actually be able to treat people that need this help, which is white women. So there really was a sense that, when I was looking at a lot of the research and the mind frame, I think another thing that bothered me about doing the research was seeing that there are statues erected of him. He's revered as a doctor, and like you said, this is more like a butcher. This is a sick person that could. I'm sure these women screamed. I'm sure these women were uncomfortable. I'm sure these women expressed probably fear about what was happening. And fear was something that you weren't allowed to really have, which also deals with outcomes that we have today, where Black women a lot of times will go into situations that are maybe not necessarily comfortable, or they have reservations about. I've heard people say, well, he was trying to help her, so that's why she allowed this to happen. It's like, she didn't allow anything, because she didn't have the ability to refuse anything.
There's no consent here. I mean, we're not talking about a consent for a procedure. She's owned. It's either I get this or I get something even worse, right, where I'm beaten or killed, or right. So I mean, that's just insane to me. And you think about, I've read stories about there were men that held them down at first, and then other women who were going through this procedure were then forced to hold them down. So it's just like piling trauma on trauma on trauma for me to have to experience this and then hold you down while you have to. It just boggles the mind. I'm not sure how these women survived this sort of thing. And then not to mention, I'm absolutely sure that many women died from infection, just because of the fact that he didn't know what he was doing. Blood loss, infection, that we probably don't have the documentation for that, but I'm sure that it happened.
Yeah,
I'm absolutely sure. And it's something, unfortunately, that's being propagated even now, because we still have people out here, and this is going to be a touchy subject, but we still have people out here who just want to learn in a lot of these public hospitals that serve mainly Black and brown bodies. They want to see every disease process. They want to operate on everything, but they see Black and brown bodies as things I just need to become the top doctor or the top surgeon, or to go on and have statues erected of me one day, but they don't really care about the people that they're serving. And I'm gonna stop right there. But we know that exists, and we see that all the time, and that's a real sore spot for many. For many physicians. I mean, we see it. We see research going on that's unethical. We see it all the time. And it is something that really needs to stop. But, in terms of where we are now, Liz, as we look at the statistics, when we look at what's happening now with Black birthing people, as we wrap up our conversation, how do you think that what has happened historically is affecting what we're seeing currently with Black and brown women not necessarily receiving respectful care in birthing spaces and in women's health care spaces, and with Black women being 3 to 4 times more likely to die in around the time of childbirth?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think myself as a mom, when I first had my first daughter, she's in her 20s now. I did not know the statistics at that time because I was not doing social justice advocacy. I was literally working in higher education, but in the very beginnings of my career. But there was a sense that I'd heard a lot of women in my family talk about negative experiences with the birthing process, some of the things that their concerns were overlooked during their delivery, pain medication wasn't administered in a timely fashion, and things like that. And it made me take pause. It made me definitely want to have a Black woman, gynecologist and Black woman, to deliver my baby, because as the trust in an obstetrician, I felt like I really wanted to trust someone that looked like me. So I think what has happened in the present day is that now I know statistically Black women maternal outcomes are really dismal compared to our counterparts. White women are mortality rates for the newborn children that we deliver is also not on par with our counterparts, white women. So there is a sense that we know something is happening. Anecdotally, we know that statistically it's been proven that there is a disconnect there. And I definitely feel like it has a lot to do with this idea that Black women's bodies are just not as not looked at, Black and brown women just not looked at as, there isn't that same amount of concern. There isn't that same amount of empathy. There isn't that same amount of, let's get to what's happening here. Let's get to the root of it. It's almost like when we go into these birthing situations, the doctor may be dismissive. The doctor may have preconceived notions about a Black woman, about her concerns. There may be a sense that she's maybe not as educated. So we even see Serena Williams, who said, even as a millionaire, she had a lot of concerns when she had her daughter, that her concerns were not being addressed. So it's not it's not, oh, well, maybe if you had the ability to have better access to treatment, then your concerns would be addressed. We know that this is strictly race-based. We know that doctors just don't tend to take Black women's concerns when they're going through the birthing process, and quite quickly, shortly afterwards, there isn't that same amount of, maybe they're not as being responsive. They're not doing their due diligence. They're not double checking. They're not maybe escalating things, situations that need to be escalated. So I think it's very important that Black women be more, the system has to change. Doctors have to be called out on their behavior. The system itself has to address these outcomes and look at ways to, in medical school, address this head on. This outcome isn't happening. How do we make sure this happens? And we see a lot when it happens to do a race, there is this sense that we have to tiptoe around it. We don't want to address it head on, but it's happening. And women's lives and the lives of their children, their newborn babies are at risk. So really, I feel like it's a two-pronged effort. There has to be an education within medical schools, within the community of doctors, to address this head on and make sure that solutions are developed that are not to call people out and make people feel bad about themselves. It's like, this is happening and this is not a personal attack. I've posted about it on LinkedIn and people have attacked me and said, oh, you're saying all white doctors are racist. I never said all white doctors are racist. But at the end of the day, if outcomes are poor based on race, we have to address the behavior of the doctor. And secondly, Black women, we have to go into a situation where we educate ourselves, don't feel bad if we're calling the doctor out. If we have questions or concerns, empower ourselves. It's not just on us to change the system, but at the end of the day, it's our baby, it's our life, it's our maternal outcome. I know for myself, I have not had a white doctor deliver any of my children because I felt as though I did not want someone that I would have to butt my head against a wall where that person was not going to see me and understand my concerns and would be empathetic. When I found both the doctors that I had were very empathetic to my concerns. So we have to not get into this mindset of, oh, the doctor knows best. I can't question. I can't, if there's something that's not right, I don't want to make the doctor feel as though I don't trust him. If you're in a situation where you don't trust, you definitely have to empower yourself. We've seen that with the pandemic. A lot of times our outcomes are not as good and we almost feel like afraid to question a doctor. And I think that goes back to historically as well. You were taught that, hey, the doctor knows better. You don't question the doctor. He knows what he's doing. Who are you to question? And we have to question. And we have to make sure the doctors are held accountable. That's the only way that we're going to make change.
I absolutely agree with you. And one thing that I think we need to, and one thing when I give talks about this, when I work on speaking up against racism in the healthcare space, I talk about the fact that we all have biases. We all do. And it doesn't make us bad people or bad doctors or bad nurses or bad healthcare workers, but it makes us human beings. And we need to understand that those biases exist so that we can then address them. And we have to work on not just saying that we're not racist, but understanding where our biases are and then working towards becoming allies and anti-racists. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to continue to propagate the systems that we were all brought up in. Not only is there, interpersonal racism that's occurring, there is internalized racism that's occurring because, certainly Black OBGYNs may understand the Black experience better, but then there are also some of us who have internalized some racist ideas about Black women, and we may have some things that we have to work on ourselves. We are Black, so there's so many complex things that are happening in this space, but certainly history plays a role in that. And I'm just so grateful to you for taking the time to have this conversation today and to just kind of remind us about where we've been. And it helps us to see where we're going, because the rebirth of joy is all about how we get back to the place we were before all of these things started to happen, when we were in a place where we were safe, when we were in a place where we were valued, when we were in a place where we were able to appreciate our culture and our heritage. And our culture and our heritage started long before we came to the United States, long before colonization happened in African countries. As we think about going back to that place, and even though we may not be on the same continent anymore, we can still reclaim those same beautiful practices, the same love, the same joy, the same community and connectivity that we enjoyed before we were brought to this place. And even though we are in a new space, we can still have that same beautiful historical love for our children, love for our families. And so thank you so much for joining us, Liz. You're always such a wonderfully positive voice, bringing great information. I'm going to be posting, if you're watching this on YouTube, all of Liz's information on LinkedIn and how you can get your hands on a subscription to the Black History and Culture Academy so that you can learn more, and follow Liz on her platforms and check out her podcast. So we will see you guys soon on the next episode. Make sure you're staying tuned on BTV and on YouTube. Catch you soon, girl gang.